Hi, everyone, and welcome back to The Good Doctor's coverage of Hulu's show, Mrs. America. Excuse me. I am Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And I don't have COVID, I promise. I just have terrible allergies. Oh, they're so bad. So in this episode, we are talking about episode 6, which is entitled Jill.
Jill, our dear friend Elizabeth Banks.
Just like every other episode previous, was a lot about Jill, but a lot about Phyllis.
Yeah, it was a good half and half. And then there was some Jill and Phyllis intersections, so
the Jill Phyllis scene in the bar is one of my favorite of this series so far. I honestly will say, I think this is my favorite episode so far.
It was really good. It was really good.
I appreciated how it was constructed. There was lots of things I didn't know already.
Yeah.
I will tell you that the conversation in the living room with the Rose is like major flashbacks to fundamentalist conversations I've had.
Yes. Yeah. What's your woman's name? Hobbs? Something Hobbs?
I missed it, to be honest. So basically what happens in this episode is that we follow Jill, who is played by Elizabeth Banks, who is a staunch Republican in the way Republicans were back in the 70s.
I know, right?
A pro-choice feminist Republican because she is fiscally conservative, a big player within the party, evidently a personal friend of Betty and President Ford, First Lady Ford and President Ford, has a husband who is being considered to be Ford's second vice president running mate.
Yeah, her husband was, I looked him up after this episode, and he was like involved in politics for a long time. He was head of the EPA and like had a lot of like on the National Security Council at one point and like other kinds of things. So the Ruckleshaus is a very prominent political family of that time. And
I mean, as is the case in so much history, not anybody that most of us have probably ever heard of. So, so that's on the Jill side. We see essentially, we watch her as the Republican Party comes apart at the seams. It's a really poignant moment where she has devoted her entire life to this identity, and somebody else is coming along and re-identifying her.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell there's going to be a lot of mourning and figuring things out and where that goes. And offline, Dr. Erin and I were talking about, like, we were unaware that the pivot point in the Republican Party towards more evangelical, fundamentalist, conservative in morality and not fiscal conservatism, we were unaware it came at this point, but it did. Between the 76 and 80 elections, that's really when the GOP became what it is now. Yeah. And in the terms of the American civic religion, the marriage, there's a lot of colleagues of mine that would argue that the early 80s are when separation of church and state became something that we joked about instead of something that we enshrined. So there's a lot there. We get Jerry Falwell's first shout out.
Yeah. And Jesse Helms leading the prayer breakfast is a hat tip to a lot of that.
And very clearly their very narrow definition of Christianity. I say that because I identify as a Christian and they would not say I was one. So I feel very authoritative to call it narrow because it excludes people. Yeah. And so that is interesting. So that's on the Jill side. And we'll get more into Jill in a few minutes. On the Phyllis side of the story, Phyllis continues to realize that, how do I put this kindly? Not everybody is willing to march to her drum immediately. And if she really wants the power that she wants, she will also have to make concessions. If this story is accurate at all, you cannot convince me that she thought that queer people were perverts or that people who have abortions need to go to hell until she was standing in that field with that woman and the dead deer.
Yeah, I mean, what she's shown us throughout this whole season, right, is that she is always willing to make the political sacrifices.
Yep.
Kind of similarly in a way to how Bella was willing to look the other way against the scandal of congressional secretaries and the sexual abuse and assault of the secretaries by the congressmen. Yeah. But she's always making those political calculations, right? And So I think that scene was really important for that pivot point, where she, has clearly gone back and read some scripture that she can show to this woman when she shoots the deer. And then also when Jill confronts her in the bar in Washington and asks her says what we have been saying this whole time, right? Like, I know you aren't passionate about the ERA. Like, why are you doing this?
And what's really interesting too is she always assumes she's the smartest person in the room.
Yes, it's very Hamilton-like character trait.
With Hamilton's matching hubris.
Yeah, exactly.
She always assumes that she's smarter than everybody else. And she is not.
No.
She is smarter than a lot of people because she's more conniving. And she thinks strategically and not relationally, which does culturally make her different from many women.
Yeah.
But it's also, she is allowed to do that because she doesn't have the cultural expectations of most other women of the time.
Yeah, and she meets her strategic match kind of in this woman, whatever, Hobbs. I don't know what her first name is, the evangelical lady.
She's even beyond evangelical. She's fundamentalist.
Yeah.
She's fundamentalist, yeah.
Because Phyllis clearly feels like, a nice crystal candy bowl.
Candy bowl? Yeah.
Candy bowl is going to be enough to buy this woman's 15,000 person mailing list. And she's clearly thought about this. She bats right back at Phyllis when she's like, I'd like a position on your board. And she's like, yeah, how about vice president? Also, it's very Burr-like what's happening. We're going to keep making Hamilton references all summer. Kids, get used to it. But yeah, she, effectively says there are two things my mailing list cares about. Abortion.
There are two things they're scared about. Yep.
There's two things they're scared about: abortion and homosexual people. And that's what's going to motivate them to get out and become activists and to vote and to join this movement.
Yeah. So again, like we've been saying before, you win elections by gathering people who think they have no problems, and who enjoy extreme privilege. Tell them what the big threat to that privilege is, tell them who to blame for it, and that's how you win elections.
Yep.
And we're going to see that really, really clearly, I think, maybe not in 1976, but certainly in 1980. We're going to see it again in 84. We're going to see it again in 88. We saw it in 2016. It's a perpetual theme of how especially very conservative movements win elections. Mm-hmm. It's not, fear is a much more powerful motivator for fundamentalist movements than anything else. So one of the other things I noticed in this episode, I don't know about you, Erin, but again, we keep getting this really complicated picture of what it means to be a woman.
Yeah.
And the idea of, Bella has this very black and white, like, sure, we can sacrifice, we've mentioned this already, individuals to the greater cause of sisterhood, where Shirley, and then I think we would agree, the sisterhood means nothing if we're willingly letting girls get sexually assaulted by their bosses.
And their bosses so that Bella can win a Senate seat. Yeah. So I think there's that juxtaposition between Shirley kind of being the moral compass and trying to right the ship, and Bella comes around at the end and apologizes. And then I think for the conservative movement, it's that same scene with Jill and Phyllis, right? Where Phyllis says some really horrible things about those congressional secretaries.
Yep.
And Jill's like, that's us. That's all of us. We are all in this, like, it's that saying, right? Like, none of us are free until all of us are free. Like, why is it okay for those girls to get treated that way and for you to not be treated that way? And we get a glimpse of Phyllis kind of being uncomfortable with that, I think, in the meeting in Reagan's suite where the men start making horribly sexist jokes.
With a great soundtrack drop.
Yeah, and then the song at the end, it was like, and then she gets told, like, we're dropping the ERA from the platform, like, just suck it up. So what did all her work accomplish to get her in a room where stuff is happening and still be the butt of jokes?
Yeah, she's still the secretary. Like Bella said, they think of us all as secretaries.
They think of us all as secretaries, yeah. But that's what I kept thinking throughout this episode was like, it's so good at showing these different perspectives of womanhood and the different perspectives on these key issues like abortion and gay rights and sexual assault and abuse and power and all this kind of stuff, without making any of it seem stereotypical or contrite or anything. It's just like, it's very realistic that like it's hard to wrangle a lot of humans who have different worldviews and opinions
Yep.
into any movement, be it conservative or liberal leaning.
Yeah. The story continues to be complicated. We, of course, know that the ERA will not be ratified by the end of the show because it is not ratified now. Spoiler alert, still not ratified. The conversation, I appreciate a lot of the news clips. That one woman saying, I can't believe in the 1970s, in the eve of the bicentennial, we're having a conversation about whether or not women are equal.
Yeah.
Because that's how I feel. Like when I found out exactly what the ERA was and that it wasn't ratified and that there is actually no legal protection for women in the Constitution, it's just implied legal protection, which baffles me completely that we even had this conversation. And then now watching Phyllis Schlafly, I understand why we had this conversation.
Yeah, and like the brief hat tips to equal pay as well was a difficult pill to swallow, where he was like, oh, women, they're never happy, like, what, you're not going to be happy until you make 100% of what men make? And they all go, yes. And I was like, oh, so what did Shirley say, like 50 cents on the dollar or something? And now the aggregate average is
79
maybe, but it's different for every racial and ethnic category.
Yeah.
But I was like, cool, it's 2020. We're doing great.
Everything's fine.
Everything is fine.
And on that note, that's all from us here. We will see you pretty soon for episode 7. Bye.
Bye, guys.